Welcome to this Instagram Live. Hi, everyone. We're going to have a conversation this afternoon about what has been called the Great Replacement Theory. Thank you for joining us. The head of the ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt, is going to be joining us momentarily. Hi, Julia. We're talking about the shooting, the awful shooting that took place in Buffalo over the weekend. 10 people were killed, 3 were injured, and it is being considered a racially motivated killing, as you all probably have heard. The gunman live streamed the attack. He also is the author of a lengthy racist screed online expressing admiration for other mass shooting gunmen and a white supremacist ideology known as I mentioned, replacement theory. So we're going to be talking to my friend Jonathan Greenblatt, who is head of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and Jonathan has been talking about this quite a bit. And in fact, he wrote a letter to the president of Fox News to talk about this and to complain about it and to say that words matter. We're going to learn a little bit more about replacement theory. You all probably remember in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I went to college at the University of Virginia, that horrible Unite the Right rally and the people saying Jews will not replace us. That is part of this replacement theory that has been propagated by a lot of different people. So I am looking for Jonathan and the ADL handle. Adriana and Julia, if you all see Jonathan at all, I'm going to go ahead and put ADL in here and invite. So far, I don't see him. I think he's had a very busy day. If you all have any questions for Jonathan, please ask them in the comments. I'm looking for ADL now. Is that you, Jonathan?
That's me, Katie. Can you see me?
I can't see you, weirdly. Can you all see Jonathan? Here, let me see if somebody, will you request to join again, Jonathan?
Sure. You'll send me another request?
Yeah, I can send you a request, or you can just join.
I'm looking at you and hearing you.
You are? How
Yes.
weird. Okay, hold on a second. Let me just do this one more time. I guess the big question is, can you all see Jonathan? Because if you all can, then we don't have a problem. You all can see him. Okay. Well, Jonathan, I can hear you. I can't see
Great.
you.
I'm sorry.
We can all see him. Thank you, Carrie Monahan, for joining. Well, Jonathan, since everybody watching can see you and I can hear you very well, let's talk about this replacement theory. First of all, it took a nanosecond for people to determine that this was a racially motivated murder because of this manifesto this 18-year-old kid wrote. I guess first and foremost, what was your reaction, Jonathan, when you heard about the shooting?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, we've seen, so many weekends, so many days shattered by these kinds of horrible news of mass casualty events, of these kinds of large-scale shootings. It's sad that it is no longer a surprise, but it's still shocking nonetheless. And I was at home when I got the call Saturday afternoon that something had happened at a grocery store in northern New York, in upstate New York. And so we quickly, the team of experts at ADL quickly were able to, because we got a call from the FBI right after the incident happened, like within minutes. We quickly got word that the shooter had posted a manifesto. We were able to identify who he was and took a look at this screed that he wrote. Now, the screed that he wrote, Katie, he had cut and pasted wholesale from the screed that the shooter in Christchurch did. So this wasn't, it wasn't an original work. He had literally cut and paste and copied whole cloth. Now, that being said, what he made very apparent, and it became very obvious to our analysts who read this thing and who recognized the patterns, he wanted to emulate that shooter. He wanted to emulate the shooter, Dylan Roof in Charleston, Robert Bowers in Pittsburgh, who attacked the AME church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015 and murdered 7 parishioners. He wanted to emulate the shooter, attacked the Tree of Life synagogue in 2018, murdered 11 people. He purposely was very clear. He targeted the Black community. He wanted to murder African Americans. And he thought in his twisted way, Katie, that this would allow him to start a, quote, war between Jews and Gentiles. Because he believes in this great replacement theory and that a cabal of Jews are using Black people to commit white genocide against the white race. I mean, clearly this is grotesque and warped and wrong on every count, but he subscribes to this racist, anti-Semitic, hateful ideology, and that's how we ended up with this horrible incident.
Well, let's talk about, the great replacement and this theory that has been perpetuated among certain groups. Basically, it's used by supremacists. It's also honestly been part and parcel of the rhetoric on Fox News. Tucker Carlson mentioned it something like 400 times. Members of the GOP, like Elise Stefanik, have used it in advertising. How did this go mainstream? This used to be considered a very fringe notion by right-wing uber extremists, but now it has sort of permeated the body politic. This venomous rhetoric has permeated the body politic. How did this happen, John, in your view? And when did we start to see it being more broadly used by quote unquote respectable people?
So step back. So the great replacement theory is this idea. It originated in France with French nationalists in the 20th century, but it gained steam about 10 plus years ago. A writer named Renaud Camus wrote a book, and he called it the Great Replacement Theory. And it was this idea that a cabal of Jews are flooding France and Europe with immigrants from North Africa and in the Middle East in order to extinguish the white race. So this was really focused on not just, Black and brown people, but really Muslim people. It's a very Islamophobic idea, trying to flood the continent with Muslims and migrants in order to, again, end France or end Europe as they know it. Now, this idea, again, he wrote this book. It really made a lot of news, and it was very quickly adopted by white nationalists here in America, who, although they didn't call it the Great Replacement Theory, have long focused on this issue that they call white genocide. This belief that Black people in particular, in America, it's Black people, let alone other immigrants and maybe Muslims, who they believe Jews are trying to use to undermine the white race. I mean, clearly it is offensive and it is madness, but it used to be the kind of idea that existed in the fever dreams of white nationalists on the fringe. It was.
But Jonathan, is it really been targeted at Jews or any person who is considered an other?
It
Black,
is.
Latinos.
Well, it's
Jews.
layered. It's layered, right? So the belief is that there's some cabal, some small group of people who are coordinating this, like it's a conspiracy, Katie. And so sometimes they're referred to as typically Jews, but we'll talk about the Tucker Carlson, because Tucker Carlson talks about it in terms of globalists or the Democratic Party. So the idea kind of mutates and it takes shape, and so other people can be blamed for it. But to your point, the belief is that Black people, Latino immigrants, like particularly from Mexico, or Muslim people, are being imported into the U.S. to, again, change the demographics of the country in order to change the electorate and perpetrate this notion of white genocide. That's how it manifests today. So he was going into this predominantly Black area of Buffalo, this particular, the top supermarket, to kill people, because he felt that would instigate this kind of war.
There are circumstances that are happening, though, in the country, as you know, Jonathan, that has amplified these fears and this hatred, and that is by 2044, the U.S. will become a majority minority population. In fact, basically white people will be outnumbered by people of color. In addition to that, there's been such a huge focus on the immigration issue. That to me seems to have accelerated this replacement theory rhetoric. Is that accurate?
I think that is accurate. I think it's fair to say that there are certain sort of subpopulations who feel very threatened by the demographic change in this country. Now, let's be clear, Katie, that isn't new. So at the turn of the, in the late 19th century, the Chinese American Exclusion Act, or the Chinese Exclusion Act, was a law passed in Congress in 1871, specifically to restrict Chinese immigration to the United States because they thought there were too many Chinese people coming. And in the first quarter of the 20th century, there was another Exclusionary Immigration Act passed, the Immigration Act of 1922, intended to keep out Italians, Irish, and Eastern European Jews, because people thought they were, quote unquote, overrunning the country. So you've seen these patterns in our history. Today, indeed, the inevitability of this demographic change, to your point, the fact that this, I lived in California for many, many years. It was my majority minority state. And that makes no difference. I mean, the idea that it somehow changes the character of the state, let alone the country, is madness. This is a nation of immigrants. We're a country of refugees. There was the first people from England who came here themselves were religious people seeking religious freedom. I mean, so it's scary to see these horrible ideas, spread like such a weed.
Well, let me go back to the question that I don't think we really answered, and that is racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. They have been around forever, but I think what is different now is the quote unquote mainstream is openly embracing some of these ideas through the lens of great replacement, of white people being replaced by others, whoever you're referring to. How can GOP leaders and Fox News anchors like Tucker Carlson use these kinds of scare tactics with impunity? And by the way, I want to remind people I'm talking to Jonathan Greenblatt. He's head of the Anti-Defamation League. I got rid of comments. If you have a question, because some of them were pretty moronic, if you have any questions, please put them in the questions section of this Instagram Live. Sorry, Jonathan, I just wanted to remind people. But back to my question. How can respected, elected government officials and highly paid news anchors spew this garbage with impunity?
I think it's really
dangerous.
No, yeah, I think I was going to say two things. Number one, I think it's indefensible. But number two, I think it's irresponsible because it is dangerous. I mean, it starts with words. And when you say unhinged, wild things about people, why are we surprised that, unhinged people then do wild things? And so we've seen this kind of ugly rhetoric. We saw it against Asian Americans, Katie, where the President Trump and many of his kind of fellow travelers were slandering Asian Americans and China around the COVID-19 virus in the early, 2020. And then sure enough, we saw attacks on AAPI people. Jewish people have seen this. There's anger about the Middle East, and then there were attacks on Jewish people here. We have people spewing this great replacement theory and slandering, Black people and slandering minorities, and then horrible things happen. So why do they do it?
Why aren't these people being held accountable? I guess the sad fact is it's feeding into existing, racist attitudes. Yeah. And it's not, there aren't even dog whistles. I mean, it's so
these are dog whistles. Dog whistles, something you can't hear unless you have the frequency. These are like alarm bells. These are like church bells, like the Church of Notre Dame. I mean, to be really frank, Tucker Carlson, we've watched this happen. And you mentioned my exchange of letters with Lachlan Murdoch. ADL has tried repeatedly to get Tucker Carlson to stop spewing this dangerous rhetoric because it leads to violence in Pittsburgh, in El Paso, and now in Buffalo. But the reality is that
can I interrupt for a second and ask you, what was the response when you complained to Fox News about this kind of inflammatory rhetoric? And it's not just Tucker Carlson. It's sort of their entire primetime lineup seems to use this kind of language.
Yes. So it's Tucker Carlson, it's Laura Ingraham as another active proponent of this. And it shows up in some of the other shows a little more subtly, but Tucker and Ingram are the ones who do this with the most frequency, and by the way, in the most unabashedly racist, hostile language. So I wrote a letter to Suzanne Scott, the president of Fox News, asking her to push Tucker Carlson to stop spreading this hate. I actually got a response not from her, but from her boss, Lachlan Murdoch, who's the CEO of Fox, who wrote back and basically said, I have deep respect for the ADL and your work over in the last 100 years. My father got an award from you before I came to ADL, I don't know, 15 years ago, that my whole family was proud of. And frankly, I think you're wrong. I think Tucker Carlson doesn't believe in the great replacement theory, and he actually this is not racist, it's just political talk. And I responded, Katie, and said, number one, I wouldn't give your father the award today. If I were, I would give it to him, number one. And number two, to be honest with you, I don't think we can countenance this because the consequences are real. This isn't just an abstraction. We've had multiple people kill, shoot, again, parishioners in a synagogue or shoppers in a Walmart. And we can't just stand idly by and pretend like words don't matter. They do matter.
Jonathan, they often react by saying it's really a conversation about voting rights, right?
Yeah, so part of what they try to do, Katie, it's a bit of sleight of hand. They say, well, no. This is just about, there's some Democratic politicians who've said the country is changing and we'll have a majority soon as the country changes because people of color tend to vote, pull the lever for the Democratic side versus the Republican side. But like to somehow describe people making a political prediction with people espousing a white supremacist conspiracy theory is madness. There's just no equivalency. And I think we've got to call that out for what it is. It's duplicitous, Katie, and it's dishonest. The fact of the matter is when you know that individuals commit acts of hate and violence because they're egged on by this paranoia, I think rational people have an obligation to stop participating in it.
Yeah, but then you get into the whole free speech argument, right, Jonathan?
Sure, but the reality is I believe in free speech. I really do. I mean, we're a civil rights organization. We've been fighting for the First Amendment, Katie, likely longer than anyone on this Instagram Live has been alive. But there's also with free speech comes responsibility. And which voices do you choose to privilege and which points of view do you choose to publish? And Fox News makes a decision, like Tucker Carlson makes a decision like you do, in terms of who you bring on your show. You're making an editorial decision. You don't bring white I don't know, I don't want to speak for you, Katie, and how you book Instagram Live, but you choose to put a white nationalist on, and then you live with the consequences of that. That's a conscious decision.
White nationalists, although I did interview some people when I was covering that Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville to understand what brought them there and what their philosophy was. And honestly, I did hear young men parrot this great replacement theory from all kinds of neo-Nazi groups. So
yeah, I mean, you remember they chanted, Jews will not replace us. This is what they were talking about, this cabal of Jews working to replace them with black people or Muslim people or whatever toxic idea that they might have. So I think, again, we need to hear from multiple sides. We need to contextualize moments like Charlottesville, but it can be done in a way that is dignified and that doesn't lend credence to these ideas, but exposes them to the sunlight that's typically our best disinfectant.
Jonathan, I have to ask you about this AP poll, which was really disturbing. I want you all to listen carefully, people who are watching this. An Associated Press poll shows that 1 in 3 American adults, 1 in 3, a third of the country, believes that there's an effort underway to replace native-born Americans with immigrants for electoral gains.
I mean, that's AP?
Yeah.
So I guess I have two thoughts. My first is a qualifier that I often don't trust polls because you don't know how the questions are framed or whatnot. But that being said, it really is when someone like Tucker Carlson has the largest prime time or the largest audience in prime time
3 million.
is parroting
Out.
every single night. And by the way, we should also keep in mind, Katie, it's not just his program. The videos are then shown on YouTube. He has a radio program as well. And so these ideas become mainstreamed, and you see how it seeps into the kind of the collective conversation, and people start to believe this.
And I wanted to mention, I know that but this bears repeating. He has mentioned replacement theory over 400 episodes. And it started in 2016. So it is the Trump administration, obviously. But and that's a very good point about sort of the digital tentacles of his voice. But who else are the major perpetrators of this? Is it right wing radio?
Yeah.
Is it, are there? I mean, I know that Liz Cheney tweeted today, the House GOP leadership has enabled white nationalism, white supremacy, and anti-Semitism. History has taught us that what begins with words ends in far worse. GOP leaders must renounce and reject these views and those who hold them. Have you heard, first of all, I want two-part question. Who are the major perpetrators of this really dangerous language and philosophy? And have you heard any GOP leaders or anyone who is doing just that, refuting those claims or rolling back on this kind of rhetoric in the wake of this shooting in Buffalo?
So a couple things. So I think, look, Steve Bannon and Sebastian Gorka were big proponents of this idea. I believe Stephen Miller was as well, but I don't know if he was on the record, but he just wrote many of the speeches that President Trump said that alluded to this. Again, Ingram and Carlson on Fox. There are other radio hosts who propound this idea. But Katie, our analysts at ADL have watched. What happens is that you find ideas like in the kind of cesspool of white supremacist media or, Signal or Telegram chat groups. And then they move to places like 4chan or 8chan or Reddit. And then they migrate to the Daily Caller or Breitbart, which seem to mine these sources for stories. And then they get sanitized and show up on the Tucker Carlson show. And then it ends up in like RNC talking points. So I really respect Liz Cheney, because in the aftermath of this, she did speak out, and she's been such a voice of such character for so long on this. People like Adam Kinzinger have spoken out about it. People like Mitt Romney, people like Pete Meyer from Michigan. There are other
really represent the core of the current Republican Party.
No, it's true. I mean, look, I recall just a few years ago when Kevin McCarthy, he stripped Steve King of his committee assignments when he was engaging in this kind of hateful rhetoric. But today, they seem to give people like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Paul Gosar a pass. And it's a bit hard to square, because the Republican Party has not traditionally been hateful like this. And I don't think that many of the people propounding these ideas represent where the party is. But it becomes hard to make sense of that, Katie, when their leadership doesn't actively and intentionally call it out.
I have been doing a lot of things today, so I haven't kept up on everything. But is this a case of the silence being deafening in terms of the GOP response, other than Liz Cheney?
Well, it's interesting. There are sins of commission and there are sins of omission, right? And so there's a sin of commission when people like Carlson knowingly, as you said, over 400 times last year, talk about this again and again and again. Then there are sins of omission where people simply don't show up when it counts. And this is one where I would have liked to think there'd be a unified front from all sides in the hours after this happened, when the manifesto was identified. But we haven't seen that. And look, both parties have their problems. Extremism isn't unique to one side or the other, but this seems to make a clear and cut and dried case where moral leadership matters.
I want to get to a couple questions. I know you have to go in a minute,
Please.
I want to be considerate of people who have asked questions. Someone is asking about the Horseshoe Theory and how Can you explain what that is? Because I'm not familiar with that.
So the Horseshoe Theory, I think it was another French political scientist who theorized this, that the political spectrum is not sort of a 180-degree line, if you will, The political spectrum is more like a horseshoe. And so instead of being like this, it's like this. So what that means is that the extreme ends are not out here in opposition to one another, but instead they actually converge. And so as you look at the extreme left and the extreme right, you actually see almost a terrifying degree of similarity. So sometimes that shows up in different forms of prejudice, like the far right hates the Jewish people, some of the far left hate the Jewish state, and they echo the same tropes. You often see this in terms of kind of illiberalism on both sides, trying to cancel the voices they don't like, think they don't deserve to be spoken. You see this in terms of almost an authoritarianism that you get from the extreme ends of the spectrum. So the horseshoe theory of politics is this notion that, again, the spectrum is not like 180 degrees, if you will, with people with total opposition. It's actually more like this. But the challenge with the horseshoe theory, if you believe that, is how do we strengthen the center and extend out the center and use that to push back on the extremes, no matter where they come from?
You know, I've been doing a lot of reading about polarization and several articles. Jonathan Haidt wrote a great piece in the but there was also, I guess, a study on polarization by this group. I think it's called the Common Good. I don't have it at the top of my head, but basically, Jonathan, the super extremists really account for less than 10% on either side.
That's right.
Vast majority, 77% in this poll or study, actually consider themselves moderate and believe in compromise. So, but what's happening is there is such a imbalance in terms of how vocal the two extremes are versus the middle, that a lot of us think that the country is much more polarized than it actually is. And people in the middle are afraid to speak out because it's too risky and they don't want to get destroyed by these two extremes on either side. How much credence do you put into that? And how can we empower, as you say, more moderate individuals who don't espouse these extreme and often hateful philosophies?
I must say, I think that is a very accurate assessment of the situation. We know that most Americans treat each other with decency and kindness. We know that there's an abundance of compassion in this country. We know that at the community level, people come together. What has happened, I think, is you have bad actors who have so poisoned the conversation. There's a kind of bullying and intimidation that goes on, Katie, where people are afraid to speak out. And you have this loud minority, this squeaky wheel that overpowers the silent majority, right? That doesn't want to engage in name calling, in bomb throwing. You see this, I think it's a group dynamic that you see play out in different spheres. You see it on social media, where 90% of the tweets are from 10% of the people. And of course, there's a toxicity there that you would never see in real life with the way we talk to one another. So what do we do about that? I think number one, the social media companies have a responsibility to move away from this old axiom of it bleeds, it leads. They should not algorithmically amplify intolerance. And it can be done. You shouldn't just live stream someone because they click post. It should be a verified account. I mean, the shooter on Saturday, live streamed the attack on Twitch, Katie, because the platform has no checks and balances. So anyone can hit post and that just happens. Maybe that's not such a good thing, right? I think it requires political leaders to take risks, much like Liz Cheney or like the folks in the Problem Solvers Caucus, Republicans like Pete Meyer, who I mentioned, or Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey, who show a willingness to work across the aisle with members from the other party. And I also think we desperately, desperately need government can also support initiatives that bring people together. I'm a big proponent of national service. And that's a remarkable program that allows young people to serve in their communities. Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives and rural and urban people to meet each other in the middle. More efforts to restore hope, more efforts to build community are needed now more than ever.
Just one last question before you go. Someone asked, and I think this is actually very interesting, but nuanced and complex, asked what was the relationship between critical race theory and replacement theory. And I think basically what that person is getting at is the way that critical race theory has been politicized to
Yeah.
and misrepresented in
Yeah.
terms of national discourse, and how that has inflamed people who are already angry and fearful of becoming a minority. Can you, does that sound accurate?
No, yeah. I mean, look, I think CRT has been mischaracterized. Look, I think people like, Ibram Kendi and others who called attention, or um, Wilkerson, who called attention to these issues of Isabel Wilkerson, who called attention to these issues of caste and race and the institutionalized race system, which exists. There is a problem with systemic discrimination in this country. All the data, like you can't look at the data and deny the reality of literacy rates or sentencing guidelines and so on and so forth. That being said, it can be taken too far for sure. But I think there are people with a political agenda who've taken CRT and turned it into a boogeyman and used it as a catch-all for anything that they don't like vis-a-vis education.
And to feed and to feed into pre-existing resentments
Yes.
that validate those resentments.
Yes. It contributes to this kind of pervasive paranoia, right? Oh, there's someone taking things away, coming to get me. So I think we've really got to ask ourselves, the people peddling these fictions, the people pushing this kind of mischaracterization, what is their real agenda? Because at the day-to-day level, no one's teaching CRT in high school. No one's teaching CRT in kindergarten, for God's sakes. And so I think we all need to, when I think about what do we talk about, Kate, in terms of fighting hate, we use kind of a heuristic. We say, number one, speak out. When you see hate happen, step in and say something, especially when it's coming from someone on your own team. Just because you politically align with someone doesn't give them license, or you license, to ignore when they say something intolerant. So you got to interrupt intolerance. But secondly, and germane to your question, or the person's question, we talk about at ADL sharing facts. And what we mean by that is dialing down the drama, treating people the way we ourselves want to be treated. Remembering the adage of you start by loving your neighbor, not by, screaming at them, and taking people, treating people with the kind of decency, again, that we would hope with which we would be treated. I don't think those, hoping for, imploring that kind of compassion, I think it's needed now more than ever. I really do.
I do too, Jonathan, but I hate to say it because I'm a very positive person, but at this point, it seems a little like a pipe dream and a bit kumbaya-ish to me.
Well, look, the reality is like I said before you get to any of that, number one, we've got to push these companies to do better. And if they don't, self-regulation is a bit of a euphemism for no regulation. The government needs to intervene and treat these companies like we treat big tobacco.
Are you talking
big
about
oil?
Media platforms?
Yes, the social media platforms. I think that's where it starts, Katie. I think that's where it starts, number one. Number two, again, we should expect more of our political leaders. And we need to boot out the people who are pushing these kinds of lies and these conspiracy theories.
Yeah, but that's gaining traction. And in fact, it's almost as if people feel like they're required to do this. I think Elise Stefanik didn't start out like this, but she figured that this was the best path to power.
Yeah, I mean, I can't argue with you. I think the Republican Party needs a kind of reformation. And oftentimes, there's that theory of organizational design, storming, norming, performing. And we're in the storming phase right now. We've got to get through this. And I say we've got to get through this because our country needs it. Like, things can unravel. I think, Katie, we often take for granted this democracy. We take for granted these institutions. We take for granted these values that were built over hundreds of years. We have got to remind ourselves that this is fragile and it can fall apart if we don't put our shoulder to the wheel and work to make it better.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. I couldn't see you, but I could hear you loud and clear.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for talking with us, and thanks everyone for joining in this discussion.
Thank you.